The ball hits the brick with a sharp, rhythmic crack. Raynold tracks the rebound, his feet moving in a blur before he drives it back against the wall. Thud, bounce.
Strike. He is 12, and the world is defined by the distance between his boot and the target.
He lunges, twisting his frame to catch a deflection, his stride long and relentless. The ball skitters toward the street, but he pivots on a dime, recovers, and sends it rocketing back into the center of the masonry. From the porch,
his parents watch, their applause cutting through the afternoon air. He grins, his eyes fixed on an imaginary defender,
dancing past the empty space with a confidence that ignores the world beyond the alley. He dribbles, feints, and strikes, the ball returning to him with perfect predictability. Every movement is fluid, precise, and entirely consumed by the game. He does not stop. He does not tire. For now, the game is the only reality that matters, and he is the master of the pitch. The rhythm of the wall kicking died, replaced by the persistent, mechanical hum of a ventilator. Raynold drifted into consciousness, his senses assaulted by the scent of antiseptic and the harsh, clinical glare of white lights. He lay still, his body feeling heavy and distant, anchored to the bed by plastic tubes. He blinked, trying to orient himself, but the room was a blur of sterile surfaces and cold metal. He shifted his weight, his hand instinctively reaching down to pull the thin, starched hospital blanket higher. His fingers grazed the edge of the fabric, but as he reached further, his hand met an impossible void.
He froze. A jagged spike of panic shot through him, sharper than any physical pain. He gripped the blanket, his knuckles turning white, and pulled it back. His gaze fell to the end of the bed. The weight of his left leg was gone. He stared at the empty space, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, uneven rhythm. The reality of the amputation settled into his mind, heavy and suffocating. He let the blanket fall, then pulled it over his face, burying his screams.
The room amplified the sound of his shuddering, muffled sobs, sealing him in a silence that no sound could penetrate.
The car door slammed, sounding too loud in the quiet driveway. Raynold moved through the front door,
his movements tentative. Guided by the familiar layout of his home, he retreated to his room and shut the door.
Sealing himself away from the muffled voices of his parents in the kitchen, the room felt smaller.
The walls pressing in with the weight of things he could no longer do. He sat on the edge of his bed,
his gaze drifting to the corner where his old football sat. It was deflated, slumped against the baseboard,
covered in a fine layer of gray dust. He remembered the feel of the leather against his instep, the way it moved in response to his slightest touch. Now it was just an object, a relic of a person he felt he had left behind in the hospital.
He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the surface, but he stopped.
The gap between his fingers and the ball felt like a chasm he could not bridge. Outside, the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds,
illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. He pulled his hand back,
gripping his own knee, and stared at the ball until the shadows stretched long across the carpet. The silence of the house was absolute, punctuated only by the distant, mocking sound of children playing in the street.
The ball sat there, a silent challenge in the corner of the room. Raynold watched it for a long time,
his jaw tight. He shifted his weight, sliding off the edge of the bed until his right foot touched the carpet.
He reached out, nudging the ball with his bare toes. It rolled forward, hitting the wall with a soft, hollow thud. He tried to follow it, leaning his weight forward to push off.
But his center of gravity betrayed him. His balance vanished. He tipped sharply to the right, his arms flailing as he tried to catch himself. There was nothing to grab. He hit the carpet hard, the impact jarring his shoulders and sending a fresh wave of frustration through his chest. He stayed there, face down, the texture of the rug rough against his cheek. He did not move to get up.
He let his limbs go slack, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. Slowly,
he rolled onto his back. He stared at the ceiling, watching the slow rotation of the fan blades.
The room felt vast, empty, and suffocating. He realized then that the distance between who he was and who he had become was not just a physical gap, but a wall he was not sure he could ever climb. The carpet felt cold against his skin, a stark reminder of his stillness. Minutes stretched into an hour, yet Raynold remained motionless, anchored to the floor by the weight of his own bitterness. He finally pulled himself toward the window, his movements slow and deliberate. He hooked his hands into the frame and hauled his torso upward,
bracing his weight against the wall. Through the glass, the neighborhood was alive. He saw the flash of movement, the quick pivots, and the rhythmic sound of leather striking grass. A group of boys raced across the lawn, their shouts sharp and clear in the crisp air. One of them kicked the ball high, a perfect arc that caught the late afternoon light.
Raynold watched them, his fingers whitening as he gripped the ledge. The sounds of their laughter drifted through the pane,
unfiltered and agonizingly vibrant. It was a world he had been part of just weeks ago,
now rendered unreachable. He saw them celebrate a goal, a sudden eruption of energy that made his own silence feel deafening. He could not watch any longer. He let his grip slide, his body sinking back into the dim interior of the room. He turned his back to the window, pulling the heavy curtains shut, effectively erasing the light.
He sat in the dark, listening to the fading echoes of the game, until only the sound of his own heavy breathing remained.
The park was a maze of gravel paths and open green spaces. Raynold navigated the terrain with a heavy, rhythmic thud. The metal crutches bit into the loose earth, each step a calculated labor of balance and effort. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground,
watching his boots drag over the stones. He was not looking for anyone. He was just moving to escape the house.
A sudden, sharp sound of a ball bouncing stopped him. It was a rhythmic, confident thud. He looked up. A boy stood a few feet away, a ball tucked securely under his left arm. He was not using crutches. He stood perfectly upright, balanced on a single leg with the ease of a statue. This was Noah. He did not lean. He did not wobble. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed and entirely composed. Raynold froze, his knuckles white against the foam grips of his own supports. He blinked, expecting the boy to tilt or fall, but Noah remained steady. The silence between them grew, heavy with the weight of that impossible stability. Raynold scanned the boy, his eyes darting from the empty space where a leg should have been to the calm, steady expression on Noah's face. The frustration that had defined his days began to fray at the edges, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of confusion. For the first time in months, the heavy, dark fog in his mind cleared just enough to let in a sliver of something else. It was not relief, not yet. It was a question. Noah shifted his weight, the ball dropping from his arm to the gravel with a soft, controlled bounce. He tapped it with his foot, the movement fluid and precise. Raynold watched, the metal of his crutches vibrating against his palms.
"You do not have to stop playing," Noah said. The words were quiet, devoid of pity.
He kicked the ball again, a short, sharp pass that stopped inches from Raynold's boot. Raynold looked down at the ball,
then back at the boy. His breath hitched. The idea felt foreign. A door he had locked months ago and forgotten how to open.
Noah pointed a finger toward the east, past the rows of trees where the sounds of a match echoed faintly. "There is a team waiting," he added. He held Raynold's gaze, his posture steady and unyielding. Raynold glanced at his own crutches, then toward the distant field. The wind carried the distant whistle of a referee. The internal walls Raynold had built around his own perceived limitations began to buckle. He took a single, tentative step forward, the metal tips scraping against the pavement.
The invitation hung in the air, a challenge that demanded more than just a nod of agreement. Raynold looked at the ball,
then back at Noah, the confusion in his eyes hardening into a resolve he had not felt in a long time. The morning air was sharp, smelling of damp grass and fresh soil. Raynold reached the perimeter of the field.
His knuckles aching from the grip of his supports. He stopped. He had expected a slow, tentative crawl of people struggling to move.
But what he saw forced him to drop his gaze from the horizon and lock onto the pitch. The players were everywhere. They were moving in a blur of motion, their crutches snapping against the turf with the rhythmic precision of a heartbeat. One player pivoted on a single foot, his body tilting at an impossible angle to shield the ball, before launching a long, soaring pass. Another sprinted, his crutches acting as extensions of his own momentum, closing the gap between him and the defender in seconds. They did not look like victims, before he struck the ball with a clean, audible snap. The ball sailed toward the net. The keeper dove, his crutches scraping the ground as he extended his reach to deflect the shot. It was a display of sheer, raw coordination that defied everything Raynold believed possible. He stood motionless at the edge of the grass, his jaw set, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the game before him. The world he had known, defined by limitation, vanished. Raynold stepped off the pavement and onto the grass. The surface was uneven, softer than the concrete he was used to. He set his crutches, leaned forward, and pushed. He wanted speed. He wanted the flow he had seen seconds ago. He swung his legs, but his timing was off. The left crutch caught a divot in the turf. His momentum vanished. The world tilted sideways, and he hit the dirt with a jarring thud. Dust coated his palms, and the sting of raw earth burned his skin. He did not wait. He pushed himself up, his muscles trembling from the sudden exertion. He tried again, focusing on the rhythm of the swing. Left, right, step. He moved 3 yards before his rhythm shattered. The ball sat nearby, mocking him. He lunged for it, tripped over his own support, and face-planted into the grit. Sweat dripped into his eyes,
stinging and hot. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tight enough to ache. He forced himself up once more,
his breathing ragged and shallow. Every attempt ended in a stumble, a slip, or a collapse. The grass was no longer a field of dreams. It was a wall of resistance. He stood, wobbling on his single leg, his knuckles white against the foam grips, eyes fixed on the ball that remained just out of reach. Raynold stayed on the ground, his chest heaving against the turf. His palms were raw,
stinging from the friction of the dirt. He heard the rhythmic tap of crutches approaching, then stopping. A shadow fell across his face.
He looked up. The coach stood over him, his face unreadable, but his eyes steady. He reached down, not to pull Raynold up, but to rest a firm, heavy hand on his shoulder. The pressure was grounding. It stopped the frantic vibration of Raynold's muscles. The strongest players are not the fastest, the coach said, his voice cutting through the noise of the distant traffic. They are the ones who never quit. Raynold looked at the coach, then at the ball lying inches from his grip. The frustration that had fueled his collapse began to drain away, replaced by a cold, hard focus. He realized that speed was a hollow goal if it lacked the foundation of persistence. He took a long, slow breath, tasting the dust and the air. The coach remained still, waiting. Raynold pushed his palms into the grass, found his balance, and hauled himself upright. He did not look for the ball this time. He looked directly at the field, his gaze locked, his posture straightening. The cycle of falling had ended. A new, quiet resolve took its place. The transformation did not happen in a single day. It happened in the quiet hours before dawn and the long stretches after sunset. Raynold began with the basics,
repeating the same motion until his shoulders burned and his breath came in jagged gasps. His palms, once soft, began to thicken. The skin tore,
bled, and eventually hardened into thick, protective calluses against the foam grips of his crutches.
He trained when the sun beat down on the pitch, turning the grass into a furnace that singed his lungs. He trained when the clouds broke, drenching the field in freezing, needle-like rain that made every pivot a gamble against the slick turf. The rhythm became his heartbeat. Swing, plant, launch, swing.
Plant, launch. He stopped tracking the number of falls. They were merely markers of progress now.
Not failures. He worked through the ache in his muscles, the sting of sweat in his eyes, and the biting cold that seeped into his bones. When his arms felt like lead, he pushed for one more repetition. When the ball eluded him, he reset and started again. He was no longer the boy who expected the field to be easy.
He was a machine forged in friction, turning every drop of sweat into a permanent layer of resolve. The rigidity finally broke. Raynold stopped fighting the momentum of his crutches and started using it. He learned to lean into the swing, allowing his body to arc forward in a single, continuous motion. The hesitation vanished from his stride. He moved with a newfound fluidity, his weight shifting between the steel supports with the grace of a pendulum. He practiced the strike until his left foot moved like a piston, hitting the center of the ball with a sharp, echoing snap every single time. He no longer looked down to check his positioning. His eyes stayed locked on the target, calculating angles and distances as he sprinted across the grass. He cut sharply to the left, pivoting on a single crutch, his core tight and stable. The ball stayed glued to his boot, responding to every micro-adjustment of his hips. He accelerated, the distance between him and the imaginary goal closing in seconds. He planted firmly, drew his left leg back, and unleashed a strike that sent the ball whistling through the air. It was no longer a struggle against his own limitations. It was an extension of his will. He looked at his hands, firm and steady on the grips, then back to the field. He was ready. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the pitch in long, cooling shadows. Raynold walked off the grass, his breath slowing to a steady rhythm. He sat on the bench, unstrapping his gear.
His hands felt heavy, the muscles twitching with the residual energy of the day.
He wiped the mud from his crutches, checking every screw and joint. A loose bolt on the left grip caught his eye. He reached into his bag, produced a small wrench, and tightened it until the steel held firm. The metallic click echoed in the quiet evening. He stood up,
testing his balance one last time before heading home. In his room, the air felt thick with the weight of what was coming.
He laid out his gear on the floor, lining up the crutches and the ball in perfect order.
He did not turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, listening to the distant hum of the city,
his mind replaying the geometry of the field. Every pass, every sprint, every strike.
He closed his eyes, his fingers tracing the worn texture of the ball.
Tomorrow would be the test of everything he had built. He lay down, but sleep remained a distant, elusive thing. The stadium lights hit the grass with the intensity of a midday sun. Raynold stepped out of the tunnel, the roar of the crowd hitting him like a physical wave. It was not the quiet, controlled practice field. It was a cavern of noise. He planted his crutches, the rubber tips gripping the turf, and looked across the pitch. The opponents were already moving, a blur of motion that defied his expectations of speed. The whistle blew, sharp and piercing, cutting through the chanting.
The ball was in play immediately. Raynold lunged forward, his muscles snapping into motion. He felt the vibration of the ground as others sprinted around him. It was chaotic. It was electric. He dodged a charging defender, his crutches swinging in a tight, precise arc that allowed him to maintain his momentum. He felt the air rush past his ears as he accelerated. He was no longer training. He was surviving the pace. He reached for the ball, his focus narrowing down to the white leather sphere rolling across the green. The game demanded everything, and he gave it. He tightened his grip, leaned into the next stride, and pushed toward the center of the fray.
The clock ticked toward the final stages, but the score remained trapped in a stalemate. Every inch of the pitch was contested. Raynold felt the grit of the turf beneath his rubber tips as he pivoted,
his shoulders screaming from the repeated impact. The opposition was relentless, a wall of bodies pressing forward, forcing him to retreat. He caught the ball on his left foot, but a defender was already there, cutting off his angle. He swung his crutches to create space, the metal ringing as they struck the ground.
Sweat blurred his vision, dripping steadily onto his brow. The air in the stadium felt thin,
heavy with the collective breath of thousands. Every pass was intercepted. Every break was stifled by a desperate sliding tackle. He saw the coach on the sideline, face tight, signaling for more movement. Raynold gritted his teeth,
his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. He pushed off his left leg, driving himself back into the center of the chaos. The ball bounced wildly between players, a frantic pinball of motion.
There was no room for error, only the raw, grinding friction of two teams unwilling to concede.
The final minute loomed, a closing window of opportunity that felt like it might snap shut at any second.
The final 60 seconds dragged like hours. Bodies collided and fell, the sound of panting breaths drowning out the crowd. Suddenly, a clearance from the back line soared high, an impossible arc against the stadium lights. The ball hung in the air, spinning toward the empty space between the midfield and the goal. Raynold saw it. He didn't look at the defenders. He didn't look at the clock. He pumped his arms, the metal crutches biting into the turf with rhythmic, violent precision. He pushed, his left leg burning as he accelerated past the scrambling pack. A defender lunged, but Raynold shifted his center of gravity, swinging his weight through the crutches in a blur of motion. He was alone. The ball descended, bouncing once, twice, spinning toward his path. He skidded to a halt, planting the rubber tips deep into the soil. He felt the vibration travel up his arms, steadying his frame. His muscles locked, every fiber taut with the necessity of the moment. He breathed in, the cool air tasting of ozone and grit. He adjusted his stance, his eyes fixed on the white leather. The ball was coming down. The world narrowed to the distance between his foot and the target. He was ready. The ball hit the grass with a dull thud and popped up, perfectly level with his hip. Raynold did not hesitate.
He swung his body forward, using the momentum of his crutches to anchor his entire frame. His left foot connected with the center of the ball. The impact vibrated through his arms, a sharp,
singular jolt of pure force. He watched the ball leave his boot, a white blur cutting through the stadium lights. The goalkeeper lunged, fingers stretching, eyes locked on the trajectory. For a fraction of a second, it seemed the keeper might reach it. The ball rose higher, defying the desperate reach, and curled inward.
It kissed the inside of the post and dropped into the net. The stadium did not cheer at first. It detonated. A wave of sound crashed down from the stands, shaking the very earth beneath his feet.
Raynold stood frozen, his crutches still planted in the turf, his leg trembling from the exertion. He watched the white ball settle in the corner of the goal, the net still swaying from the impact.
The air was thick with the roar of thousands, a deafening wall of noise that drowned out his own breath.
He had done it. He let his crutches slip slightly, his grip loosening as the reality of the moment took hold.
The silence in his mind lasted only a heartbeat before the world rushed back in. A blur of movement erupted from the sidelines.
They reached him before he could find his balance. Hands grabbed his shoulders, his back, his arms. He was hoisted into the air, his crutches falling away to the grass as he was lifted toward the lights. The ground vanished. Gravity felt irrelevant as he rose above the pitch. The sound of the crowd was no longer just noise. It was a physical force, a rhythmic, thundering chant that vibrated through his ribs. Every face in the stands was a blur of motion, thousands of arms raised in unison. He looked down, seeing the green field beneath him, then up at the towering stadium rafters. His teammates shouted, their voices lost in the collective roar. He felt the weight of their hands, the heat radiating from their chests, and the sheer, overwhelming momentum of the moment. He gripped the nearest shoulder, his knuckles white, and allowed himself to be carried. The rhythm of the chant intensified, a single name echoing against the steel and concrete of the arena. It was a tide of sound, and he was at the crest, suspended between the earth and the humming lights above.
The surge of his teammates finally settled, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the front row of the stands.
His parents were there, faces wet with tears, their hands locked together in a tight, white-knuckled grip. His mother pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with the force of her relief.
His father stood rigid, eyes fixed on the man his son had become, a look of profound recognition crossing his features. They did not cheer like the others. They simply held onto each other.
Anchors in the storm of the crowd. Raynold saw them. He reached out, his fingers brushing the air toward the sidelines.
The team lowered him back to the turf. He regained his balance, his arms locking onto his crutches. He felt the grass beneath his feet, firm and real. He turned toward the center of the stadium, looked up at the blinding white glare of the floodlights, and lifted his crutches high. They caught the light, gleaming like steel banners. The crowd responded with a sudden, thunderous surge of noise, a wall of sound that seemed to push against the very sky. He held the pose, chest heaving, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. This was the peak. This was the proof. The chanting began to soften, echoing off the stadium walls like a receding tide. Raynold lowered his crutches, the metal clicking against the pitch as he planted them firmly. He stood in the center of the field, the grass damp beneath his feet. The stadium hummed, a low vibration that seemed to match the steady rhythm of his own pulse. He turned his head, sensing the lens tracking him from the sidelines. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the scoreboard. He locked his gaze into the camera, his breathing slowing to a measured pace. The tension that had defined his years of struggle drained away,
Replaced by a quiet, absolute certainty. A small, calm smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of arrogance, but of arrival. He held the gaze for a heartbeat.
Then the world dissolved into shadow. The stadium lights vanished. The sound of the crowd cut out, leaving only the silence. On the empty black screen, white letters emerged.